Welcome, everybody, to Unlock the Middle. I'm Chris Starcheski, your co-host this evening, along with my good friend and colleague, principal of Charlton Middle School, Dean Packard. This evening, we've got a very special topic for you. We're going to be unlocking homework tonight with a very special guest. For our viewers out there, we'd love you to participate in our chat this evening by submitting comments from whatever method you're using to watch us, be it Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, or Twitter Live. Enter comments or questions into that comment section. We'll go ahead and share them up on the screen and address them if we can. We look forward to being with you. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Unlock the Middle. Dean Packard, how are you tonight?
Chris, that was an incredible introduction to the entire show. Chris, you know how excited I get on Sundays. Not only is it a time to unwind, but it's also a time to dig in and find a topic that can really help educators really fine-tune their craft. And tonight, we're not going to disappoint. We went out and found a real rock star, understanding of homework, inside and out, and we're going to have a great conversation about how to make homework effective and make it real. I can't wait. Super excited. Again, great intro. Great to see you, my friend.
Back at you, Dean. You know, anytime we can talk about a topic that is meaningful to educators, students, and parents, it brings us all together and starts to ask us questions like, what's the purpose? How can I rethink this? How can I use this differently? How can I take advantage of something that's been in place for so long and implement it in a new way? And tonight, we've got the man to do that with us and give us these key points. It's my pleasure to, yeah.
Yes, before you do that, let's pinpoint this a little bit about homework, because in back of my mind, and I've been sitting in this seat now for 18 years as an administrator, and homework has always been like a kind of a mountain for me, because not every home is suitable. Not every family is suitable to help. Homework from levels, from the way the teachers see it, sometimes it's all over the place. So the compass and the guide we're going to get tonight is going to be a real big outcome. So before we bring in our guest feature tonight, I know you're going to do his bio, you're going to read through it, and you're going to make it special. And I can't wait to start our conversation with him.
Your point about homework and home environments is really key, Dean. And I think about it in a different way sometimes, you know, as a home learning, an extension of that classroom. And that's where we're going to get tonight. How do we reframe and rethink and make adjustments to something that's traditionally been where it is? Well, as I mentioned, this man has got it going on. Dr. Erik Youngman is a career educator serving from a first grade classroom to assistant principal and principal. He currently serves as the director of curriculum instruction and assessment for the Libertyville District 70 in Libertyville, Illinois. He is a staunch advocate for continuous learning, feedback, growth mindset, metacognition, innovation, and visible learning. As the director of curriculum instruction and assessment, he's affecting change from the ground floor up and from the top floor down. He is the author of 12 Characteristics of Deliberate Homework. Dr. Erik Youngman. Welcome, Dr. Youngman. How are you tonight?
I'm great. I'm looking forward to an awesome conversation.
Well, again, we want to welcome you, and we had an opportunity to speak with you a little bit on Friday, and I'll tell you, just that conversation alone, just getting to know who you are and what you're all about, really was the spark for us for this weekend to prepare for this conversation about homework. And as you know, homework it's a big topic. It's one of those things that is in the mind of every educator, and how to roll it out and how to do it effectively is always that mountain that we all have to climb. So again, we're looking forward to the conversation, and welcome aboard.
Thank you. Two topics that I look into a lot are homework and grades, and parents are definitely passionate about those topics. And now that a lot of schools are experiencing hybrid or remote learning, homework is very pertinent because they're still doing that independent practice. So I'm glad we're able to talk about this today.
Absolutely. Hey, let's dig right in here and let's take a look at this. Like, one of the questions that I had in the back of my mind that I really want to throw out there to you was, how does homework connect to classroom experience? What should that look like? Does every homework assignment have to go back and connect directly to what was learned? Do we have students dig further? Do we do it as support? What do you think that should look like from the perspective of a teacher?
I mean, ideally, homework and independent practice for remote learning is meaningful. And in my book, and when I try to concisely talk about it, it needs to have a meaningful purpose. It needs to be aligned with meaningful learning targets like standards. It needs to have meaningful format. You can't always just have the same homework every time. Sometimes the format needs to be modified for the learner or where you are in that process. And then it also needs to have a meaningful sequence. You may think that you need to be on page 26 of your textbook, but if the students aren't ready for it, you might need to go slower or modify and reteach before you get to that. But I think ultimately when you're talking about homework, hopefully it's empowering self-assessment and reflection and goal setting. And I think also when you're really thinking of learning, you hope homework and any type of learning really inspires students, their passion, their curiosity, and creativity. I frequently talk about continuous learning with a growth mindset. So if you're assigning any work in the school or at home, hopefully at least it does not discourage any of that. But ultimately, I really focus on having meaningful, purpose, learning targets, format, and sequence. I think that's how homework can be the most meaningful.
You know, Dr. Youngman, as you have written the book, if you will, on 12 characteristics of deliberate homework, and we sit down and we think about the ideas around metacognition and learning to learn. How does homework really benefit the student? You know, we've talked about at the middle level that 10 minutes per grade level per night for homework. Is there a formula that fits the amount, or is this more complex?
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts about that. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So hopefully homework is kind of thinking about learning. In general, I think it should be occasional and concise. You can talk with different school districts, different administrators, different families, and they may have different beliefs. Some people think you should never assign homework, and I'll hear that a lot on Twitter. And some people think it should be mandatory. And the whole focus of my book is if you're going to assign it, it should be meaningful, occasional, and concise. Another pertinent topic right now that we're talking about is equity. And so we have to take into consideration the students. What's their home life like? Is it low income? Do they not have access to anything? Homework should look different or take into account if it's a low ability student or a high ability student. I have 3 daughters. They're active in sports. They're student athletes. How much time are the kids spending working or doing a sport? And is that taken into account? If I really think about homework, I think it also needs to be reasonable regarding completion time, complexity, and frequency. And those are the first 3 chapters in my book. When we're talking about completion time, we need to make sure that students understand the strategies they can use when they're stuck. It doesn't matter if it's a kindergarten student, if it's an 8th grader, if it's someone at the university, when they are stuck, what strategies can they use? Because all of that will impact completion time. You may have a student who is a low ability student and they struggled all through the day, and now they're going to do a homework assignment that will take an above average student 2 minutes, but it's going to take them 1 hour. So you really need to be cognizant of that completion time. Also, reasonable complexity. Again, you have to ensure that students have that meaningful guided practice before they go home and do that homework assignment. And then also frequency. We want to make sure that there's collaboration among teachers. I know your focus is the middle school. It's similar in the high school. We need to understand what other teachers are assigning on those days so the students are not completely overwhelmed and bombarded. A lot of teachers like to have a Friday test. Well, if a student has 6 Friday tests, that homework and preparation looks a little bit different. So I guess I would give 4 examples when I'm talking about the middle school. One of them would be assign differentiated homework based on need. I know sometimes classes are already leveled at the middle school, but we can still differentiate homework. One student might do well in a math pre-assignment, and then maybe they just have a couple practice problems, whereas the other student might need to relearn it, or another student might need extension activities. Another example at the middle school could just be allowing multiple days for students to complete a list or a choice of activities. Again, that empowers that flexibility and choice. A third one could be scaffolded supports and check-ins for long-term assignments. I know I've heard some feedback. Well, if I assign multiple days for someone to finish the assignment, they wait until the night before. Well, if we build in some check-ins, we can support those students. And then finally, this example is in my book. It's a little rigid, but at least it could empower some conversation about it. If students are getting bombarded with homework in middle school and high school, we could basically have an example where social studies Homework is always due on Monday, and if they have assessments, it's on Tuesday. Science could only have homework due on Tuesday, and their assessments are on Wednesday. Math could be Wednesday homework and Thursday assessments, and language arts could be Thursday homework and Friday assessments. So that's a crazy example, but we talk about all these problems and no one is coming up with solutions. So at least this is an example of how we at least can be cognizant of some of the challenges and some of the solutions with homework.
You know, you hit the nail on the head. You know, as a dad, as well as principal, you know, 3 kids, a junior, a 7th grader, and a 4th grader upcoming, all involved with athletics or dance, all involved in the student life of the school, and all very responsible academic students. Balancing that load for them is extremely complex. And like you mentioned, we identify all these problems all the time, but we don't always open ourselves to solutions or suggestions. So I think you gave some amazingly strong examples. Sorry to cut you off, Dean. I just had to get the dad comment out in the perspective.
No, I mean, I was caught up with the balance at home. And if you have students who are athletes or if they're involved with other organizations after school and trying to balance time and organize time, one of the biggest issues or areas of concern for kids, time management. And, you know, in that homework and that control piece, as a teacher is trying to get kids into that curriculum to a high level, you know, and they want them to do so much at home, it becomes a very unique and tough situation for kids to balance their time. So unless you have some management skills with that, it's very, very difficult. And having 3 young kids playing sports, you're absolutely right. That's got to be tough. Mine are all older at this point in time, and I watched them navigate through it. But you also touched upon something that I really liked as well, and that's strategic planning through the teams. Like in the middle school, not having homework assignments on certain days, make sure you vary them. That is a huge piece of ensuring that kids aren't going to drown on one particular day in order to get and meet all the standards by the homework that is set forth. Very, very big. So I'm going to stretch this a little bit further if I could. And I'm just going to talk about fostering independence outside the classroom. You know, we have all types of learners. We have students who are really motivated and they can take off on their own and do it. But we also have some trying to figure out why it's important to do homework. What does it mean for them? So how do we foster that love for kids in regards to having them want to learn when they leave our schools? Such a big topic and something that's very hard to really comprehend for some kids.
Yeah, great question. I think that autonomy and agency and choice and voice, I think they're definitely critical. I think in the end, teachers need to make sure that they provide guided practice and scaffolded supports and model that problem solving I talked about before, just so the students can be independent. Another part we don't talk about a lot, and I do in my book, it's about that understandable communication before, during, and after. So we need to make sure we assign assignments that it's clear for that student, and we need to provide feedback because that's critical. But if we just focus on the students and how can we inspire them to want to learn, I think a lot of that I can connect with growth mindset. I talk a lot about growth mindset. I think it's very pertinent for athletes, for performers, and definitely for students. So a couple examples. One of them, I refer to it as a learning mindset because we can empower students to be responsible, reflective, resilient, and resourceful. I looked at growth mindset a lot, and you can really start to categorize some of those topics. So if you're looking at students who want to do their work, if we can talk and model and empower how to be responsible with their effort, if they can take ownership, if they can have that passion and desire to learn, that's really what you're asking. But we need to model that and provide some of that to them and have them learn that responsibility. Also, where they can seek challenges. They're not just trying to get that A grade. Also, when we're talking about reflection, they can think, what am I missing? What do I still need to practice? Talk about resilient. What can I celebrate for progress? What can I learn from a mistake if I don't get it yet? How can I focus on the moment or believe that you can learn? And then resourceful, I think, is really important for that problem solving. How can you ask for help when you need it? How can you take risks? How can you embrace challenges? Other things that align with the growth mindset are self-direction. So how can we learn and adapt? How can we focus our effort? How can we be motivated? And then, like I said, about problem solving, one of the things I've recently been focusing on is how can you get comfortable being uncomfortable? You need to get out of your comfort zone, and you need to know in math, I'm going to struggle. This is a challenging problem. I will persevere. I will get through this. But ultimately, we hope that we're modeling that curiosity and creativity. So if that's what we want our students to end up thinking, we need to provide them opportunities for that. So open-ended questions. So I think in the end, teachers need to provide opportunities where they're giving choice, they're allowing students voice, where they can write about what they want to write at times. And then I think ultimately that should facilitate some of their thoughts about curiosity and creativity.
Wow. You really captured the essence of, 21st century skills in your approach to homework. You talk about, independence, autonomy, capturing creativity and individuality. You talk about all of those tidbits of those 21st century skills that we've been talking about as educators for a number of years now. And we've been talking about them less in a compartmentalized way about homework as a leverage tool for those. We talk about it being homework as a part of going there. Your approach to talk about it big picture around this fostering independence is really key. As we enter into a school year like no other, we're not going to be brick and mortar for all the school year and for all students, at least where we are right now. We're going to be opening remotely for several weeks and then coming in a hybrid model for part days across, who knows how many weeks. As we think about the traditional homework practices and homework structures, how learning is being extended, we're actually going to be in an environment that home learning is taking place. Talk a little bit about the shift in rethinking homework platforms, not just for the system that we're going to be involved in now, but how can we really shift and shape homework practices and homework structures beyond this wacky start to our coming school year?
Yeah, a lot of the teachers are teaching remotely, so it's a great question. We need to be cognizant of the demands on students. So if we're looking at that independent practice, again, I go back to that independent practice or homework. I think should be reasonable, meaningful, and occasional, and it should be targeted practice. So we should be thinking about specific skills rather than a large open-ended project. I think there are some things we need to unlearn and change as well to make homework more deliberate. I think when we talk about frequency, and this is the same as independent practice, I think instead of daily or never, it should be occasional. For the amount, instead of unreasonable, I think it should be concise and efficient. For complexity, rather than too easy, busy work, or too difficult, it should be differentiated, meaningful, and deliberate independent practice. For support, rather than providing feedback after learning attempts, it should be provide timely feedback. And I think that one's really critical. Sometimes you assign this project or homework or an assessment at the end of learning. The teacher does the grades, they provide the feedback, the student doesn't act on it or learn from it. And I think a big part of this independent practice, if this can happen during learning and feedback can happen, that feedback can help the student change. And then the teacher can learn from that student and modify their teaching as well. So that feedback, I think, is two-way, one to the teacher and one to the student. For the assignment, rather than the same assignment for everyone, I think new homework should be empower choice regarding process, product, complexity, or amount. It's basically differentiation, but that doesn't always happen. Usually the teachers are assigning the same homework, and it doesn't always have to be that way. And then I think another part is due date. Rather than always do the next day, allow multiple days to complete the activity. So I think anytime you can enhance flexibility, I think, again, that just empowers those students that have different home learning environments, or they may be involved in other activities, and they may have different caseloads in different classes.
Well, I'll tell you a couple things that resonate with me right out of the gate here. As you're talking about targeted practice, specific skills, flexibility. You're talking about changing what the traditional model of homework is like, and quite frankly, that excites me because that gives students a whole new perspective on learning. And quite frankly, one of the things that we didn't talk much about, and we could get into it just a little bit, is like flipping a classroom. What does that mean? What does that look like when you flip a classroom from a teacher perspective? And all of a sudden you become a conductor as an educator, and you allow those students to take care of their own learning and at the pace in which they can actually be successful at. So could you speak a little bit about what a flipped classroom might look like in regards to from a homework perspective?
When I focus it on homework, I like to talk about the complexity of the questions. And so sometimes in math, you may get through those easy problems, and the end of the homework assignment is complex problems that not all kids can independently answer. So one way of flipping it is to have the student do the independent work that is lower in complexity and easier. And then once you get to class, that's where you can have the discussion about those higher rigor or higher complexity of questions. I think that's the best example. Other ones are, again, thinking through what can you do in advance. Can you watch a brief video to introduce you to a concept, and then you can just have a richer discussion during class. So that concept is out there. I'm glad you're asking about it because, again, this pandemic is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to change how we're teaching and give students different opportunities. So flipped classroom is one of those examples.
I love the way you twisted that as an opportunity because you're absolutely right. We're not going to sit there and dwell on things we can't control. So we might as well learn to maximize what we have as a learning platform. So thank you for saying that. Hey, Chris, I'm going to switch it back to you right now because we've got a great panel of individuals who are looking to come in and ask some questions. So why don't we bring them in and introduce them? And let's go a little bit kind of round robin here so they can speak about the conversation they heard.
Sure. Again, Dr. Youngman, fantastic points in terms of addressing homework. I wish when I was a math educator back in the 90s and early 2000s that I had this perspective because I was always looking for ways to engage my kiddos in different ways and to provide challenge. Our first follow-up panelist is a student. Let's go ahead and get that perspective. He's going to be a 9th grader. He's rounded out his 8th grade year over at Charlton Middle School. Let's welcome in Gavin Wallace. Gavin, how are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us, kiddo.
Yeah, no problem.
So Gavin, we're going to give you the floor for a second. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Gavin. Gavin is an outstanding student. Has really come into his own. He is more than ready for high school and great things are in his future. There's no doubt about it. And Gavin, you've had a journey along through 4 years in middle school. Talk a little bit about what you heard today from Dr. Youngman and how you advanced through our middle school and what homework was like for you.
Well, personally, like when I first started, I came in 6th grade and I thought I was like pretty good with time management. Like I know you, Mr. Beckett, you were talking about time management and how that's important. Personally, I do pretty good with it. It can be a challenge sometimes with sports, like, to have time for different things outside of homework. I mean, not really fortunately, kind of unfortunately, I'm not going to be doing soccer this year, so I'll have more time in that area. But as I went on and starting 7th grade and 8th grade, I kind of got better at realizing that there was a certain structure, like get home, have an hour for a snack, do any chores I have to do or whatever. And then I just sat down and got my homework done because it was honestly easier for me to just get it done with and then not have to worry about it. I know other people, I would see them doing their homework on the bus on the way to school or in the cafeteria before school. And I'm that's kind of adds an extra layer of stress. Homework can already be somewhat stressful, especially if you have a problem that you're not really familiar with. I know that happens to me a lot of times in math. I know you guys were talking about let's say you have those easier problems that you already know how to do. You learn them in math and you get home, you get to the homework, you get to the last 3 questions and you're like, I have no idea how to do these. I'm completely lost. And then you just kind of got to take it in the next day and you're like, hey, I couldn't really get these 3. And I think it would also be good to implement the sort of thing that you were saying, okay, you couldn't really get these 3. So let's talk as a class, as a whole about, how we could different strategies we can take to these problems. And I also really like the idea you were saying of maybe instead of one night, instead of having a piece of paper homework, maybe you watch that YouTube video, that little thing that talks about the topic. So when you get into the classroom, everyone understands it and they can actually talk about it. And, I think the word used was richer, way better understanding of it. And, just makes it a lot better.
I think you're right on there. And Dr. Youngman, if you want to just comment back to him, that'd be great.
Yeah, great discussion. Great thinking about the routines. I think you're dead on with that. If teachers and students have those routines, it's only going to be easier. Good thought about how you have a routine so you can complete work. And then again, when we're just talking about a flipped classroom, again, I think you can have different discussions if you front load that information ahead of time. So I think you had some good feedback about that. That was helpful.
Yeah. Sorry. Well,
No, I was gonna say thank you very much. If I can, hold your thought for 1 second. I want to bring in Mr. Olson if I can right now. So
All right.
if I can just introduce Mr. Peter Olson, he's going to come in as the assistant principal of Charlton Middle School. He is the guy who's in charge of all the culture in our building and everything else under the sun. And that's what an assistant principal does. But he has a great pulse on what's happening in class. And he truly understands what the teachers are doing and the depth of understanding of the homework that's being assigned and things of that nature. So please welcome Mr. Olson to the show. Hello, Mr.
Olson. Nice to see you all. I'm have a hard act to follow there. And Gavin, I'm not sure if I can live up to his standards. That's kind of been his 3 years through Charlton Middle School. He is tough to live up to. Smart boy and is always thinking outside the box. And that's one of the reasons why I love that he was at Charlton Middle School. Couple things, especially as we go into this new year, that kind of stood out. One is the idea of a long-term assignments, a long-term homework. As an ex-math teacher, it's something I would have loved to have thought about when I was in the classroom as opposed to the nightly homework. Because I would imagine from a student perspective, and now that I've gone through raising 3 children, nothing more frustrating than sitting at home, like Gavin was saying, and not understanding something. Where if you extend that out a week long's worth of homework, you now are given that feedback in class. And I think that's the most important part of actually almost any assignment and assessment is that feedback and that opportunity to redo and learn. And I think that, just in my opinion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's what would get a child excited about learning, is knowing that it's okay to make mistakes. It's going to be fixed. Or I'm going to be taught this, or I'm going to have an opportunity to interact with my classmates and understand it. And to me, that's the joy of learning, knowing that it's okay to make a mistake. And I think right now with how the nightly homework is, it's not. It's, it's the mistake is there, the grade is there now, and it's over. And we need to get away from that a little bit.
I agree.
Dr. Youngman, you agree?
Yeah, great points about perfectionism. I mean, I remember so many interviews of people saying I'm a perfectionism, and I love thinking about sports where Michael Jordan and all these athletes are talking about how they learn from mistakes and how many shots they missed. And so I think we need to help students understand that at an early age. They can take risks. They can make mistakes. They're not being penalized. I wrote my dissertation about grading, and a lot of it, again, is don't penalize them during the learning process. Wait to grade until you're further into it. So I think that was part of it. And then the other thing, we were talking about those long-term projects. Again, I give some examples in the book where we're talking about if you send home a work assignment, the parents can build a terrific building, but we don't want that. So you can still do aspects of homework at home. So for example, you can have the discussions and pre-planning in class, and then you can have them do parts of the independent work at home, and then they build it in school. So there's some examples where, again, you can give some concise homework that is very targeted, still within a long-range plan, and still allowing students to build it at schools to ensure it's their work as well.
And I think by doing that, you touched on the differentiation earlier, and that leads to that because each student can get something different at home, but still come back and build the same thing within the classroom.
That differentiation piece is so essential to rounding out the development of the thinker and the learner. A couple of weeks ago, we had Rick Wormley on, and we were talking about fair isn't always equal, and we didn't get under the hood about grading and assessment and all of the practices associated with an effective standards-based model for instruction and assessment. But the points that you're making, Dr. Youngman and Mr. Olson and Gavin, are so powerful and important to Mr. Wormley's point about, making sure that the issue of fairness and equity is present, providing each child what it is that they need in order to become successful, and not to penalize that learner who didn't understand it the first time. That's the whole point about practice. We wouldn't be watching the NBA playoffs right now if that were the point. It just doesn't make sense to penalize in the way that a lot of our traditional systems do.
And one of the things that I get caught up on as an instructional leader, and I worry about this a lot, is reinforcing bad habits in homework and not correcting it on the spot. And again, that's an error where in the education world, we got to redo and we got to step backwards. So if somebody's doing something wrong through a pattern of times, there's nothing accomplished. So we have to be very cognizant of the fact that what kids are doing is understood and part of the bigger picture. If we get away from that and it becomes no meaning to what's going on, then we have a bigger problem. So things we have to look at.
And with that differentiation, like was said, fair isn't always equal. Again, think of those students in your class. The lowest ability student has been struggling all day. Now they need to do homework, and it's going to take them 3 times longer. Your highest student, all they need to do is do it. They don't even need to think usually. So how can we differentiate? Because we can really help all learners when we do that.
Yeah, and definitely, I was going to say that like some kids like have learning disabilities, and they can find it really hard to focus like without a teacher like on their neck, kind of telling them, like keeping them structured. And then they get home and then they just don't do it. And then they come to class and they're like, I didn't do it. But I also feel like sometimes they could try and use that almost as an excuse and like abuse it. And I also don't think that should happen. Like you kind of got to keep like a schedule and, you know, not really abuse like, oh, sorry, I forgot. Because I saw that happening a lot last year, and it was kind of like slept on and ignored. And the teacher would just be like, all right, well, here, let's go over it. And I think that they should, instead of that, they should be more like, okay, well, you know, you got to like get on that more, and not to the point where you're like on them too much. And like, you know, because they still have to have like, you know, their life and like go home and have fun and stuff, but also to, you know, get a little bit on the more stricter side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an impressive perspective from an incoming freshman, because the teacher needs to know their students. They need to hold them accountable.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But also you can focus on homework. You can do quality, not quantity. So you can focus on 2 good problems for a student rather than having them try to struggle through 10.
Yeah, and not penalize the 8 that they didn't really, you know, like get too well on, and just, you know, praise them for like doing really good on the 2 that they were able to do.
Makes a lot of sense, Gavin, and I'm glad you made that point. Hey, let's bring in your dad. Let's bring in Devon Wallace. Devon Wallace is a very invested parent here. Education is very important to the family. We have his family coming through our schools right now. We really want to hear about a parent perspective on this.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of thoughts. You know, first I was reflecting on my 8th grade experience. And when I think of my 8th grade time, homework in 8th grade, it was memorization. Good students had acronyms. You would regurgitate what you learned the next day, and the following day, by the weekend, it was all forgotten. So if I was looking back on my 8th grade year, what did I really remember from it? You know, there were a couple different spots. I will share one quick story that I do remember. My 8th grade math teacher, we're talking about grading here. A lot of times students would ask him about partial credit. You know, well, I had this part right, but this part wrong. And he would use the analogy of somebody building a bridge. So if somebody's building a bridge, they're putting the bolts in. There's a couple of bolts that they don't quite get in right. The bridge collapses, 10 people die. You know, should they get half credit for that? So so that was his take. No, there was no partial credit in his class. It was either you got it right or you got it wrong. But I do want to say a couple of things from Mr. Youngman that I took away. I was really impressed with is this. So metacognition was a term I hadn't really heard before. So the idea of thinking about thinking, but then homework being learning about learning. So I think that's maybe something to explore a little bit more. You're in the classroom, or you know, for this coming year in a virtual classroom, there's a lot of book learning. But to me, the homework is extending that to a more practical sense, learning about what you learned in the classrooms. I don't know, Mr. Youngman, if you have some more thoughts about that. I really like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can reflect and self-assess, I think that's going to be the best. If you can set goals for yourself, I think that's critical. When you were talking about partial credit, it also kind of reminds me when we're talking about grading, there's lots of discussions of, do you let them redo an assignment? And really what I've been trying to empower educators to do is let's forget that discussion and just ensure that you've provided the students with multiple opportunities to demonstrate their understanding. So we don't need to argue about can they redo it. If you gave them 7 opportunities, then you can look at their recent performance. So those are 2 reactions to what you asked.
Great.
I mean, the topics are great. I mean, what we're hearing from everybody, it's refreshing, it's invigorating. The perspective in itself is what drives what we do. So again, if we can really get the idea of homework and help our educators understand that there are multiple layers to this to be successful, I think we're all going to win. And I think it's a very important thing that we need to continue to look at under a microscope and get better at it as we move forward.
Another thing I was going to say is that looking into like how much of an impact homework has on your grade. So like some teachers, they will like have homework be 30% of your grade. Like in my opinion, that's kind of ridiculous. Like you should have a majority of your grade should be in the classroom. And they would be like, oh no, because it's like helps with how much you're focusing. But I think it should be more like 10% and like really focus on having more percentage in the actual classroom. Like definitely not completely out it and have it be 0% optional. Like it definitely does have to be there, but way less than it is now.
Nailed it, Gavin. When I'm thinking back, and again, I'm throwing my teacher hat back on and I'm throwing my dad hat back on. Again, if I'm measuring the athletes on my Little League baseball team with how well they perform in practice, and I'm making a judgment on playoff roster after week 1 of their practice, I'm setting that entire team up for failure. In terms of, big picture perspective, we have to be realistic about the opportunity to learn and fail in a safe environment, because without that failure, there's never any betterment or improvement. So, your point around the weight of the homework, I take great pause in thinking about the negative impacts of having such a great weight placed on the learning, because it does create an inequity in some cases. Students who are able to do immediately receive 30 points towards their grade. And there's not a real good metric that says that this student has learned anything beyond their ability to complete these assignments.
And if you're not great, then that's 30 points off your grade.
Exactly. And then you can't dig out because of a home situation or life circumstances. Now your max grade, if you could never do homework, is a 70, even if you're perfect on all of your assessments. It's a question of unfairness and inequity in my mind.
And sometimes you can flip it too. So instead of talking about accountability, you can talk about how the students got those answers. So as a teacher, you don't know if which students looked those answers up, which parents helped with those answers, whose answers are you grading?
Texting your friends.
Elementaries get it right. When they're doing a standards-based report card, they report homework as a behavior for responsibility. I think universities, high schools, and middle schools need to do that as well. You don't need to be a standards-based report card, but you could provide multiple grades for each subject. So for math, you could report out on 5 priority standards. And then if you do have a behavior grade, that at least will speak to that accountability and will facilitate that conversation with parents that homework is something that needs to be addressed.
You're right on. I think that's really putting things in a finite position where you can actually look at the behavior or look at the standard or look at the learning itself and move forward from there. And that takes away the subjectivity as well. When we're talking about, a teacher putting a weight on something, you're absolutely correct. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Gavin, because it's a very important thing when we're looking at equity across the board. So thank you. Mr. Wallace, do you have any other questions? Because I know that we went off for a second there.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I do have a thought that I want to put out there. This was something I learned actually from a college professor. I know we're talking about 8th grade, but my freshman year in college, the professor said the duty of educators is to teach students how to think. And so if I apply that to what we're talking about here, so, rather than 30 minutes to go through XYZ questions and problems, it's really teaching people how to think and teaching young people, and in this case of, the unlocking the middle, young people how to think. So I think if you've kind of flipped the thought of education to that, it really opens up opportunities, it opens up perspectives and kind of changes the game a little bit. We know this upcoming year is going to be challenging. I love the idea of looking at challenges as opportunities. I think it's a huge opportunity for teachers, for administrators, for students to engage this different way to communicate and learn. So to me, it's that learning how to think and how to think differently. Maybe I would also put it that way.
Yeah, I think learning how to think is great, like we're talking about, and then also just shifting that emphasis to the student. So rather than having the teacher document their proficiency on each standard, give that student that document where they can document their own progress in proficiency. So I think, again, we can help them thinking if we have them set goals and kind of measure their progress as well.
Individualized goal setting is so important and it's so powerful. Educator Robin Jackson wrote a book, Never Work Harder Than Your Students, and finding opportunities as a classroom teacher to take the work that we do at setting the stage and teaching the students how to become more responsible with their learning, providing one another with feedback, understanding how to interpret feedback and become better related to their instructional goals is absolutely essential, especially in the environment that we're coming into this coming fall. The more autonomy kids can have, the more control they can have. It allows for teachers to have deeper, more meaningful discussions as we are in this virtual environment moving forward.
And just to touch on that, I think that also teachers should be a little bit more open to student collaborations, not like, you know, giving each other answers, but like working with each other. Like personally for me, if like I work with my friend and we go through each read and you're like, what'd you get for this? They have a different answer. I'll be like, oh, how'd you get that one? And it can be really helpful. And it can also take off some of the stress of like doing it by yourself. Like I work way better with somebody else. And, you know, like school can already be stressful enough. So I think to be able to work with somebody else that you're already friends with, you already have a connection with them, like you know them not like outside of school, you're friends with them. So you're more comfortable to work with them and like, you know, come up with different answers, put your brains together, I think could be really good.
Yeah, collaboration is very important. It's good to enhance your communication skills, the talking as well as listening. And then at the same time, if you know a concept, the way you demonstrate you're proficient at it is you teach someone else that. And so if you're teaching other kids, that also can be helpful. So that's a great point.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Wallace and Mr. Wallace for being here tonight. You've done a wonderful job of joining in with the conversation and really adding some depth to what we're looking at. And, you know, Gavin, my hat's off to you. I told your dad earlier today that I see great things in your future. And I think if your conversational skills as of tonight is any indication of where you're going to be moving forward, I think the sky is the limit for you. And I think we got a place on the Unlock the Middle team for you somewhere too. You're very good at that situation. So keep that up. And, we want to thank both of you. And I'm going to give, if I could at this time, Dr. Youngman the floor, just to kind of wrap up a little bit about some final thoughts on all of the topic of homework and what we've talked about tonight. And then we're going to pull it back in.
Yeah, I appreciate the guests and the questions and the conversation. I think, again, I really just try to emphasize if you're talking about homework or independent practice during remote learning, just to make sure that it's meaningful and reasonable. And anytime that we can bring in and model and empower that growth mindset to make sure that students are trying their best and learning from mistakes, I think that's where they're going to be the best learners. And ultimately, then they'll be leaders in the future. So we need to give them opportunities to fail and support them and help them, make sure they can ask questions to make sure that we're all going in the right direction and continue to learn.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Youngman. It's a great summary on a 40 minute plus discussion tonight about homework. We certainly could go on and dissect the chapters of your book, 12 Characteristics of Deliberate Homework. I'm eager to dig into it at depth and to be able to follow up with some great questions back your way so I can pick your brain again. Thank you to the Wallace gentlemen for joining us this evening, as well as Mr. Peter Olson. Dean, you want to take us home tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a big thank you to all of you guys. And we're going to ask you to stay on this video cast when we leave, please. But again, we want to just wrap this up. And I want to thank Dr. Youngman for helping us unpack homework tonight. It's been a great discussion, and we are really excited about what we learned. And listen, stay with us. Keep following us on YouTube, follow Periscope, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter as we continue to unlock the middle. Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful night.